You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Everyone needs pants. Me, you, everyone. But what if, instead of just pants, you had good pants? Pants that felt good and looked good. And what if you just needed one pair of pants for everything? Jack Archer can help make that a reality. Instead of needing different pants for travel, work, and weekends, the Jet Setter Tech Pant is designed to do more with one pair, built for the office, the golf course, date nights, and everything in between. I have tried them, and they are comfortable. They do look good, but I'm also just a history podcaster, not a clothing expert. However, there are a whole bunch of people who really like them. The Jet Setter Tech Pant has over 6,000 five-star reviews, which is a lot. And even if you don't want to think about pants too much, the Jet Setter Tech Pant can still be for you, because they work for everything. They can just be your default. Right now, Jack Archer is offering our listeners 15% off your first order with promo code GETJACK. Go to jackarcher.com and use promo code GETJACK for 15% off your first order and see why thousands of people have given the Jet Setter Tech Pant 5 stars. That's jackarcher.com, promo code GETJACK for 15% off your first order.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 265. War at Sea 41, Part 3, Operation Berlin. This week, a big thank you goes out to Charlie and Comrade Red for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The previous two episodes discussed the plans that Germany had for the interdiction of merchant shipping en route to the British Isles through the use of various types of ships. This included the Deutschland-class cruisers like the Admiral Scheer and the Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruisers like the Admiral Hipper. It also included auxiliary cruisers, which were merchant vessels that had been converted into surface raiders by bolting some guns on them. All of these were concerns for the Royal Navy and the British leaders, but they paled in comparison to the fear of German battleships being used for the same purpose. This concern was not based on the ships being better at finding and sinking merchant ships, but instead on the problems that the British would have in protecting the convoys. The Royal Navy had many ships that were decent matches for the German cruisers, at least enough to drive them away from convoys, like the Burrick had done against the Admiral Hipper. The list of available ships that could protect convoys from the larger German ships was much more limited, which increased the fears that they could move around the convoy lanes mostly unchecked. These fears would become reality in January 1941 when the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau began their first major sortie out into the North Atlantic. This was codenamed Operation Berlin. They would spend almost 2 months on their cruise, and during that time they would encounter and either attack or avoid a number of convoys. After their successful cruise, they would then make their way back to Brest for resupply and refit in preparation for future operations. One ship that was missing from this operation, and all the others during the war, was any kind of aircraft carrier. Now, I'm only bringing this up now because I think it's important to keep in mind when thinking about how all the German surface-raiding battleships performed in their tasks. The number one problem for the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau, the Bismarck when we get there, was their lack of ability to quickly and easily scout out large areas of the ocean, and then also to protect themselves from air attack. This would make the German battleship commanders very cautious anytime air power was involved. The Germans did plan on building a carrier to help solve this problem, and in fact planning for the carrier would actually become the Graf Zeppelin, and it began way back in 1934. After the signing of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935, the aircraft carrier would begin construction in late 1936. Its design was influenced by other interwar carrier designs, including that of the Japanese Akagi, but also involved a heavy emphasis on guns and not strictly on aircraft. In hindsight, we know that this was not a good path to follow for carrier design, and these guns would be removed in later stages of the design and development. But in the early and mid-1930s, The Germans were far from the only navy around the world to make this mistake. The Japanese, the Americans, the British all would put guns on their carriers at some point before realizing that that was not worth the weight and the space. When the war started, the Graf Zeppelin was about 85% complete. However, that's pretty much as far as it would get. The plan was for it to carry 43 planes, with a mix of both a modified version of the Bf-109 fighter and the Stuka dive bomber. But it's difficult to know how successful it would have been in operations. As every navy that built aircraft carriers in the 1920s and 30s would learn, operating a carrier is hard. The plan had been to send it out with the larger commerce-rating battleships to provide both air cover and, almost more importantly, additional scouting capabilities. This could have multiplied the value of the surface-rating operations because it could have cut down on the amount of time they had to spend just searching for something to attack. I bring this up here at the beginning of this episode on Operation Berlin because the lack of emphasis placed on getting the Graf Zeppelin ready for operations, or really the emphasis placed on naval aviation in general due to the relationship between the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe, prevented the German battleships from having a valuable tool at their disposal during their commerce-rating operations. There will be many times over the future episodes of this series, while we're talking about Operation Berlin and then the operation of the Bismarck later on, where it would have been very valuable to have even a few aircraft involved. But the Germans wouldn't have that. They didn't have that option because that's not what they chose to put their resources into in the late 1930s. Even if they did not have an aircraft carrier, though, what they did have was they had two battleships that were seemingly ready to enter into the commerce rating game in early January 1941. Well, actually, they were ready to begin in December 1940, and at that time, Operation Berlin actually began, sort of. The operational orders given to the commander of the two ships, Admiral Lütjens, were to make his way into the Atlantic and seek to destroy as many merchant ships as possible. However, combat with other military ships was only permitted if the Germans had a clear advantage because they were facing either smaller vessels or only one enemy heavy ship. Just for a moment here, we should talk about Admiral Lütjens. Admirals during the Second World War, those that were commanding fleets or groups of ships while they were at sea, were in an incredible position to make a lot of decisions, very important decisions. And so who you chose to command these groups of ships was very important. He would eventually also go on to command the Bismarck's first operation. And here is how historian Graham Rhys-Jones would describe Lütjens in his book Loss of the Bismarck, An Avoidable Disaster. Lütjens was a tall, sparsely built man in his early 50s. Subordinates saw him as something of an ascetic. They described him as serious, undemonstrative, and taciturn, though they recognized an incisive mind, and they knew that little escaped his notice. His actions were never impulsive. He was a thinker and a planner, and he had learned the benefit of keeping his options open until the point of decision had come. He was not untypical of his kind. Men of a similar stamp had risen to high rank in the Royal Navy." End quote. Lütjens' views, temperament, and decisions would have a major impact on the two big operations that he would be in command of. The operation was supposed to begin on December 28th, and it would be on that day that the two ships would leave port. However, shortly after leaving port and making their way into the North Sea, they would be hit by a major storm, with the escorting destroyers suffering major damage, while the battleships would both have their forwardmost turret damaged due to water reaching the electrical circuits. To try and escape the storm a little bit, they moved to a Norwegian fjord near Kalvenes. The damage that the storm had caused could not be repaired in a random fjord in Norway, and so the ships had to make their way back to Germany, and this would delay their departure for almost a month, until January 21st, 1941. So when I say they tried to start Operation Berlin in December, I meant this little attempt here, which was thwarted by the weather. On January 21st, though, the two ships would once again leave port to begin their journey out into the North Sea through the Great Belt off the Danish coast. They would actually delay a few days to wait for minesweepers to check the channel before making their way north into the Arctic Sea, where they would meet up with the tanker Adria to refill their fuel tanks. Lütjens was taking a cautious approach here, delaying his move towards the Denmark Strait until after he had met up with the tanker. One of the primary drivers for this decision was the weather, which was very clear and provided great visibility. In this situation, that benefited the British, who were trying to spot the German ships as they moved out into the Atlantic. The Germans, for this part of the voyage, usually favored very poor weather. As the two German ships were moving north, though, the weather would change, and Lütjens would change his plans, but not in a bad way. While on the way north, the weather became quite poor, cutting down visibility, and this caused Lütjens to switch from his cautious approach to an immediate move through the Faroes Gap. This was possibly the most dangerous, but also most direct route into the Atlantic, but the weather made it seem safe enough. It would cut down on the visibility of the British ships that were watching out for the Germans, but more importantly, it made it very difficult or almost impossible for British air patrols to spot the German ships, with aircraft being far more dangerous than surface ships when it came to pinpointing where the Germans were at any given time. But then another change was made almost immediately after. This was because early on the morning of January 28th, a contact appeared on Scharnhorst's radar and was spotted by the Gneisenau. It was not perfectly clear what the ship was, but immediately, Lütjens was concerned about it being able to give off a contact report to the Royal Navy, which it actually did. The ship was the British light cruiser Naiad, and its report of unidentified ships being spotted made its way to Admiral Sir John Tovey, the commander of the Home Fleet. He would begin to move some pieces into position to prevent the German ships from moving into the Atlantic, including sending the battlecruiser Repulse into the area. On the German side, Lütjens decided to now take a cautious approach, or revert back to his cautious approach, his original plan, to move north to meet with the tanker Adria before then going on into the North Atlantic. After meeting up with the Adria, the fueling process would take almost 2 days, in part because of the problem of ice. The ships were in the far northern seas in the middle of winter, and this resulted in there being a constant level of concern around ice, both during the fueling process and also sea ice that could cause damage to the propellers. The cold also meant that men were just slower at completing the process. They just got too cold while on deck, and it also meant that the refueling process had to be paused several times for the ships to reposition themselves away from ice. During the morning of January 29th, Lütjens would communicate with German Naval Command that he planned to once again attempt to break out into the Atlantic following his original plan of going through the Denmark Strait. The Denmark Strait is the water between Iceland and Greenland, and the furthest north and west possibility for the German ships to try and make it into the Atlantic. This made it theoretically safer, but the British also knew this, and therefore there was an attempt to provide surface patrols of this area of the ocean. Maintaining as much coverage as possible to try and identify any German ships that attempted transit was the goal of the Royal Navy, but the Royal Navy ran into a problem. The problem that would cause complete failure, or almost complete failure, multiple times over the months that followed: fuel. The Royal Navy's ships did not have the ability to refuel at sea. They had to return to port, which usually was not a problem, as the Royal Navy had friendly ports all over the world. But during wartime, there would be moments where being in a specific place at a specific time was pretty important. And in this case, as Lütjens began making his way through the Denmark Strait on February 2nd, most of the British ships that could have been in the area were busy back at port, refueling after multiple days of operations. This would allow the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to move through the Denmark Strait without any major issues, and they were now in position to make their attack.
And we're live from the living room as Doug eyes up the match day spread. He's reaching for the buffalo wing. Perfect! Hang on, what's this? Oh, he's gone for a can of Pepsi too! Incredible! What a finish! Sensational combination! Look at the delight on his face. There's no doubt about it. It just tastes better. Match days deserve Pepsi. Food deserves Pepsi. Grab a pack of Pepsi Zero Sugar for today's match. It's poetry in motion.
This is going to be an extremely busy month. I have to watch 104 soccer games, follow the pregame, the postgame, yell useless opinions at the TV. It's a lot. So I knew that when it comes to screening for colon cancer, the choice was clear. The Cologuard Plus test. It can be used at home and can only take 15 minutes, so I can do it during halftime and not miss any action. If you are 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about screening for colon cancer with the Cologuard test. You can also request a prescription at Cologuard.com.
But before they could make their attack, the first priority was a trip to an area codenamed Point Black, which was a position near Greenland where the 2 German battleships would meet up with 2 German tankers. These tankers were an essential part of the entire German surface raiding plan, and they would be positioned to meet up with the German raiders to refill their tanks after their move through the Denmark Strait. Now Lütjens had to decide how to proceed based on the information that the Germans knew and what they did not know. They did know the areas where the convoys traveled, the basic areas of the ocean that they transited through, and that eastbound convoys from Halifax generally traveled a more northerly route than the westbound convoys that were also bound for Halifax. The eastbound convoys were the priority because it was known that they traveled together in this area of the Atlantic, whereas the westbound convoys would begin to break up around this area, sort of on their way west, so that they could make their way back to their home ports or their destinations in various North American ports. Lütjens also knew that there was a convoy en route from Halifax moving east at that very moment, but what he did not know was its exact position. German intelligence had been able to communicate when the convoy had left Halifax, but beyond that, all that could be done was try and calculate its position given its estimated speed. To try and cover as much ocean as possible while hunting for the convoy, the 2 German ships would spread out, giving them a total search radius of about 60 miles or 97 kilometers, which was the maximum visual search range for 2 ships that were spread out as much as possible. Because they did not know the exact line of travel of the convoy, they would search from north to south, and then at night, they would come back together and reposition to the east based on the estimated travel distance of the convoy, at which point they would again split up a little bit and continue moving across the expected route of advance of that convoy. It was estimated that it would take them about 4 days for the 2 battleships to traverse across the entire possible route of the convoy. This search plan would be put into action on the morning of February 6th, when the 2 ships would leave the supply ships off Greenland. The searching would be monotonous, but would allow for some testing of the ships in the Atlantic conditions, which were impossible to fully replicate in the more sheltered waters of the Baltic and North Sea. What Lütjens found out about his ships is that there were some challenges. They handled well when the ships were pointed into the sea or were moving into the waves directly. However, when they were getting hit by the waves from the side, the ships rolled horribly to the point of real concern. This was good information to know and would be important in the weeks ahead as the ships were out in the Atlantic and would have to deal with some storms. Now, Lütjens had not traveled all the way out into the Atlantic to test his ships in big waves, I guess. Instead, he was hunting for a convoy. And the convoy that Lütjens was hunting was HX 106, which had departed Halifax, Nova Scotia on January 30th. It was made up of 41 ships, most of which were British merchant ships, although there were a handful of Norwegian merchantmen as well, with the Norwegian merchant fleet being put at the disposal of the British after the Norwegian government had fled into exile after the invasion of Norway. The convoy was moving at a speed of 8 knots or 15 kilometers per hour, with the 41 ships spread out across 4 miles, 6.5 kilometers of ocean in 9 columns. They would be spotted by lookouts aboard the German ships early in the morning of February 8th. Immediately, the decision was made to move towards the convoy, but as the German ships moved in, they spotted a very worrying thing on the horizon. Lookouts on the Scharnhorst spotted the foremast of what was clearly a military vessel, also clearly a large one. This would end up being the battleship Ramillies. The Ramillies was a Revenge-class battleship that had been built before the First World War. The class was an evolution of the Queen Elizabeth class, with some changes that gave it a bit more armor at the cost of some of its speed. Then, during the interwar years, it had not received any major modernization. This meant that in comparison to more modern battleships, including the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, the Ramillies was outdated and slow. It had no hope of catching the German ships, but that did not mean it was not useful in its role as convoy escorts. Convoys were slow as well, and the battleship had to stay with the convoy anyway, and regardless of its age, it still mounted 8 15-inch guns. This far outclassed the 11-inch guns that were on the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Speaking of those guns, it's worth noting that the 2 German ships mounted very small guns for their size, which has even led some to discuss whether calling them battleships is even an accurate classification. You will see the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau also referred to as battle cruisers due to their small armament, although I have opted to just call them battleships because I have complicated feelings about the differences between battleships and battle cruisers and how you apply the term to one or the other that we don't need to get into here because it turns into a long discussion. But regardless, the smaller guns on the German ships had been mounted in the mid-1930s due to the fact that they were easier for the Germans to build and they were available. There were then plans for upgunning the German ships, giving them larger guns, although it would not end up happening due to the war starting. The 11-inch guns on the German ships did not matter when engaging merchant ships. They were just fine for that. They were even fine for engaging British cruisers. But the presence of the Ramillies was an entirely different problem that had to be considered. The captain of the Scharnhorst, Captain Hoffmann, moved in towards the Ramillies with the goal of getting the battleship to separate from the convoy to chase his ship. This would have presented the Gneisenau with a major opportunity because at this point in the voyage, the Ramillies was the only escort that the convoy had. As it moved east, the convoy would gain a larger escort, primarily smaller ships that were dedicated anti-submarine platforms. But this far to the west, U-boats were less of a concern. This meant that during the western stage of the voyage, the Ramillies was all that there was for the defense of this convoy. However, there was a problem with Hoffmann's plan. In order to try and lure the Ramillies away from its position, it would almost certainly require Scharnhorst to come within the range of its 15-inch guns. And even if one of those shells hit the German ship, it might cause damage that would be a major problem. Any damage to German ships might leave them vulnerable to further action as they limped home, and this was one of the reasons that when Lütjens learned of the Ramillies' presence, he decided that the risks were too great, and that the action had to be cancelled. Lütjens would receive criticism for this caution, at the time and in later analysis. At the time, Captain Hoffmann believed that Lütjens was being far too cautious, and in fact was so cautious that he was making it impossible for the operation to succeed. In later analysis, he would also receive some criticism due to this caution, turning away from what seemed like a rare opportunity to intercept a convoy without even trying to use his two ships against one, the British Ramillies, to kind of create some kind of advantage. Lütjens could hide behind the orders, which made it clear that he should not engage large enemy ships unless under very favorable conditions. But really, Lütjens was just laboring under the difficulties imposed upon him by the ships available to his command, and more importantly, the ships that were not available to him. Having two battleships was all well and good, but each of them represented a major risk if they engaged larger ships. What he needed were smaller ships that could be used for scouting as well as for engagements with merchant ships. Even one cruiser would have completely altered the situation with HX-106 because both the German battleships could have engaged the Ramillies while the cruiser attacked the merchant vessels. It also, of course, would have made finding the convoys easier as well. With a few cruisers or even destroyers, Lütjens could have searched a much wider area. This is also an area where aircraft would have been invaluable. A carrier like the Graf Zeppelin would have completely changed everything and made everything so much easier. But those smaller ships were not available, and so Lütjens was forced to be cautious. With the decision made to not engage the Ramillies, the two German ships moved back towards their rendezvous with their supply ships before they would make another interception attempt on another convoy. However, on the way back to Greenland, they ran into a major storm. During the storm, the two ships were tossed and turned violently, with the seakeeping while moving into the waves being bad and getting hit by the side even worse. They were just kind of at the mercy of the ocean. There was a real concern about the damage caused by the storm, that it might cancel or cause the ships to have to cancel the operation. Gneisenau would experience some flooding after a weld on the upper decks separated and allowed water to come into the sickbay area. The Scharnhorst had it even worse. One of its turrets would be unseated due to the rolling of the ship, and water would get in and cause electrical damage, and most of Scharnhorst's anti-aircraft batteries would become inoperable due to water damage. These experiences would result in some improvements made to the ships, actually, when they went back to port, but that was in the future. And for now, the men on board just had to deal with it. All of this damage that was caused by this storm could be repaired. It would be repaired in the days that followed. But it was a great reminder that while there was a danger from British ships, while in the Atlantic, the ocean itself could be a frightening enemy. By February 16th, all of the damage had been repaired, and once again plans could be formulated for how to find another convoy. And that hunt, that search, and that convoy will be the topic for next episode.